countdown. Just give it edit that. Welcome to another Founder Wisdom podcast. We have Bob Morris with us. Bob is co-founder, managing partner at Bravery Group. It's an M&A advisory group. Bob is in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm in Oaxaca, Mexico. It's not his first company. Trade NT was another one. He worked at Ogilvy as well. And a bunch of other cool companies I'm eager to dive to today. So this podcast is presented to you by podpair.com. If you want to start a podcast that is almost fully automated with AI, you can go to podpair.com. We have a free ebook and a masterclass teaching you how to get connections, get sponsors, get views, and of course, get neurons with podcasts. So podpair.com. Bob, welcome to the pod. Tell me a bit more about yourself and what you're up to nowadays.
Oh, great question. So let's see. I started in this space, my goodness, almost 30 years ago. Actually, 31 years ago. I didn't know. I think about that. So I've been in the digital ecosystem, digital space for a long time. I tell people that I started when it was a 1.44 meg disc and there were 4 colors. So that makes me really old. But today we run an M&A advisory firm that specializes in the digital ecosystem. So having come out of all those years in the space, about 4 years ago, made the decision to step into M&A on a full-time basis. And that kind of came as a result of having sold my firm previously. So I sold a firm that I co-founded in 2016, and it was acquired by a large publicly traded firm, and then spent the next 3+ years in the earnout. And that was kind of the driver and the motivation for then looking at it and going, I think there's room in the space for more of a specialist firm that we just didn't really see existing at the time. And so I co-founded this firm with another gentleman named Paul Newton, who at the time actually was in Geneva, Switzerland. So he has subsequently moved back to the States. But that's the firm that we run today.
Interesting. And tell me about the Inmar Group. You were CEO of that in 1997. I think that was the big first role that I see. Tell me about that one and also the first entrepreneurial experience that you had, because you were VP consulting, I guess, for most of your career at various firms.
Yeah, again, another great question. So first thing I will tell people is, as much as we like to tout the idea of really youthful leadership in companies, and especially in the tech space, man, there's a ton to learn. So I would have been like 27 years old when I became CEO of that firm. At the time, it was the 5th largest digital agency in the world. Back then, they called it multimedia. So the Inmar Group was actually the digital AOR at, you'll laugh at this, right? At Cadillac, Buick, Pontiac, Jeep, Chrysler, Dodge, and Eagle, all at the same time, along with AT&T, Fujitsu, and Alcatel. And now today, you'd never hear of that, right? Conflicts everywhere, all those kind of issues. Back then, everybody didn't really understand exactly what it was, right? Because we started off doing discs, then we moved to CD-ROM, then we moved to the web. But that was an interesting firm, right? Because when I joined it, it had already taken some money from an investment group. And that investment group was actually, has an interesting backstory, right? Its backstory was, it was the Lane and Bassett furniture companies that had been married together through an actual marriage. They lost control of that company in a hostile takeover to Furniture Brands International, got a lot of money, and then decided to start to invest in technology companies because the son was friends with Steve Case, who founded AOL. So we were one of the early investments by that company. And I will tell you that I got schooled along the way in that process, because when you have people who are on your board from Wharton, and you have investors, and you have all these people, and you're 27 years old, it's a lesson in humility in a hurry. because, ultimately you think you're really smart. There's a lot that you can learn. So, it's one of those things that I tell people all the time, that when I see incredible entrepreneurs who are very young, my first counsel to every one of them is build an ecosystem around you of really smart people who you can trust and who are there to build you up, not tear you down. But there's so much. I mean, I've been around for so long now that I can look at it and go, I've learned there's so many different iterations of who I am over time, just through those lessons and the learnings. So that was my start. And then I really went from there to a company called IXL. And that's the predecessor to what is now Razorfish, or Sapient Razorfish. And that was the roll up, right? Like that was, I think we did 29 or something to that effect, acquisitions to build that firm. And it became the second or third largest digital agency at the time. And then suffered through the dot-com bust. And then got rolled up, and I think it's been sold so many times now. But now, of course, its latest incarnation is inside of Publicis.
Wow. And what did they see into your 27-year-old self back then to give you the CEO position?
That's another really good question. I would say probably more of the, so there's an interesting position, right? Which is this idea that there's selling and there's consulting. And in truth, they merge in a really interesting way, right? So I think that what they saw in me was the ability to be able to sell the services of the business, but really through the lens of consulting. And that was really, back then, it was really what it was all about, was like, how do you help, especially in the early days of digital? You had to convince people what digital really was and what digital would really do for you, right, from an innovation perspective. I keep raising the issue of how old I am. For a long time, everybody used to say, "Man, you're so young, right?" Because I was dealing with people who were much older in business. And the key takeaway in it was kind of this idea that you were having to convince people to make really big change, right? And I love this philosophical view of there's a person who came up with this years ago who I respect tremendously, but it's make change before change makes you. And I think there's a tremendous amount of truth kind of in that. And so, the firm, I think, saw in me the ability to be able to, kind of take the firm and sell the services of the company, but also hopefully go deeper inside of the clients that, that we had.
Love that. And then the other thing that caught my attention at I think it was at IXIL, and I grew revenue under management from 350K to approximately 3 million a month. How did you 10x that?
Yeah. So we had, so a few things. One is, the one thing that I tell everybody all the time is, like, it's not about you as an individual. It's about you surrounded by really, really talented people. And I think that's kind of the key to it from a growth perspective, right? The growth portion of it has always been, going into a client and looking at the challenges and the problems that the client has, and then looking for an effective means of being able to solve for the problem through a very open lens, right? The problem that most businesses have is that they're built to sell a specific service, right? That's it. And if you have a hammer, you're looking for nails. And my argument has always been, if we ended up discovering a challenge or a problem that we couldn't solve for, then that's perfectly fine. Our job is to identify it, build it into the roadmap, and then find the partners within the ecosystem or internally within the client to deliver against it. I'm not an advocate in any way, shape, or form of, well, we can deliver anything and everything for you, because ultimately, at the end of the day, there's really only, I tell people this as well, that there's only a few things that you get fired for, right? So the idea of as a consultancy, right, management consultancy for a client, you're either on time, you're on budget, you're on quality, or you're on strategy, right? If you're off on any of those, you have a relatively high probability that you're going to end up in a review at some point in time, or you're going to lose the business, right? And as long as my teams have always understood that, on time, on budget, on quality, on strategy were the critical measures, I don't care about any of the other factors, right? That's going to keep you inside of a client and going to help you to be able to grow inside of those businesses. And I've had the privilege also of being, brought in on really large pieces of business that, you had the ability to be able to walk the halls in big companies, right? And if you're well respected and you're well known, then what ends up happening is you can't walk from one end of the hall to the other end of the hall inside of the building without people pulling you into their offices and asking you, hey, what are your thoughts here, and how could you solve for, and I won't go too long on this, but I'll make a quick comment, which is, I spent a year doing consulting at one of the really, really large retailers, and almost every week I would fly on Monday, and invariably I would miss my flight on my way back on Friday. And the reason why was because everybody was trying to push additional meetings on Friday, and you're literally trying to get out of the building at headquarters, and somebody's like, hey, we just really wanted to talk to you because we're doing a sponsorship with Mattel, and we really want to get an idea of, how would you think about doing X, Y, and Z? And the next thing you know is you're like, 45 minutes later, I'm like, yeah, I just missed my flight, right? But that was just part of it, is that you want to become that kind of trusted advisor, and that's where growth in all of my accounts has really kind of come from over the years.
And nowadays, what do you think of ChatGPT as a brainstorming tool to not be held by people to have these meetings? That can it be a good brain sparing partner to get new ideas or to actually clarify your ideas?
Yeah, I think look, I think where we sit with AI today, I think we're really in the infancy. We as a firm are going deep quickly. We're looking at agentic solutions that give us the ability to be able to take care of things like research, take care of things that used to take hours upon hours from an analyst to kind of work their way through. We have one solution today that used to take about 3.5 hours for us to do for a client. Today takes us about 15 minutes. And the great thing about that is that, once you've built the agent, forward changes that occur right over time, all you have to do is essentially ask it to, run again, look for any of those changes. So I think in terms of the brainstorming portion, absolutely. We've spent over the years, if I go back decades of work for clients, we've spent enormous amounts of time, collecting the research and the insights, right? And you are only as good as what Google gave you, right? Or the tools that you had research tools. It was only as good as that. And B, I would tell you that, the other thing that you always had to deal with was, how do you get all of it back down then to like a consolidated perspective that you're trying to now work from? And I would tell you that, across the AI tools, and clearly there's a lot of room to, everybody wants to talk about, how quickly AI is being adopted. That's very true. The quality of the output that you get really depends on the type of tool set and platform that you're working against, right? And Charles, you've seen that, right? It's like you can go and use, one AI tool set and you get this kind of feedback, and then you use another and you're like, man, that was just fundamentally flawed. Like, I already know, like, that data is just not good data. So however it was trained, was ineffective. But yeah, it really streamlines our thinking. It streamlines the time to get to really good ideas. And it also just prompts you into spaces that you may or may not have even been contemplating.
Right. Want to ask you a couple of questions because you've worked with the world's biggest brands, Coca-Cola, I see Microsoft here, Under Armour. It seems like you've checked them all, Goldman Sachs and so forth. First, how do you get in touch with these folks to convert them as clients? Is it still the ABM with AI infused nowadays? Is it a very long sales cycle? And are these big clients worth it, or do they take like pretty much all of your time and energy?
I guess I should be careful how I answer that question, right? No, yeah, they are typically lengthy sales cycles. For us over the years, it depends on whether that's a direct outreach from the client or whether or not you're participating in something like a request for proposal or an RFP. The big RFPs are typically run by third parties as well on behalf of those companies. So companies like SRI and others run those. Are they worth it? Yeah, absolutely. Timeline wise, we've had pitches that have been 6 weeks of kind of back and forth and work to try to get to a close in big companies. We've had some that have been years. and it's been round after round, and then it goes silent, and then they decide that they're going to change budgets, and stakeholders change, and all those kind of things happen. But yeah, I mean, all the clients that I've had an opportunity to work with over the years, they're they're a pleasure to work with from the perspective that you're getting to solve typically relatively complex issues that have really significant revenue implications. Almost everything that I've worked on over my career has been tied to revenue in some fashion. I'm more mid funnel to lower funnel in the kind of strategy work that I typically have been focused on, versus just things like pure brand or branding. Although it's always part of the answer and part of the solution. But yeah, hopefully that gives a little context.
Yes, it does, and especially the it's worth it part, because these clients, have big budgets most of the time, 100 to 500K range a month. So that alone can run your agency, right? It's just I think people need to be careful not to be too dependent on these clients. Maybe like 20% of your gross revenue, these big clients, because if one leaves, it leaves a humongous hole in your business, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'll flip to the M&A side just for a second and tell you that, yeah, client concentration is a huge issue, right? When a buyer is looking at a company, having any one firm that is more than 20% of your revenue, typically starts to set off red flags. Now, having said that, the reality is that there are scenarios in which having a really large client, but having a large quantity of buying centers inside of a client, really kind of diversifies that risk profile, if that makes sense, right? So you could have a Walmart, and if you're in 20 different segments of the business, all completely different contractual instruments, all those kind of things, the risk profile is quite different than if you said, yeah, we do work at Coca-Cola, and I have one master services agreement, and I'm doing $4.5 million, and my business is a $10 million business. A buyer is going to look at that really quickly and go, hold on, if that goes away, I just lost 45% of my total revenue. I'm upside down. That business is really in trouble. So the risk profile is one you always do have to be really careful with.
Right. And tell me about precisely the trade NTE acquisition, and how fundamental it was for you to learn the trades in M&A, which ultimately led to Bravery.
Yeah, so it's an interesting story, right? So we built that business prior to people calling things digital transformation. We built it as a digital transformation business. Everybody who was inside of the business was essentially a consultant and was pretty senior. So we ultimately were New York, Chicago, Atlanta, and Boulder, Colorado. And we were doing work at places like First Data, which is now owned by Fiserv, massive financial services company. We were doing work at Bank of America. We were doing work at GE Capital, which ultimately became Goldman Sachs Marcus, which is massive, right? As a financial platform. We started in the consulting services business solving really complex problems. Anthem Healthcare, right? The Affordable Care Act came out, and it was an issue associated with, how do you create empathy in a business that has traditionally been B2B, and now all of a sudden you're being shifted to B2C, right? So think about that for a second, Charles. How do you take a phone call from someone who says, my wife's cancer drug has been rejected, she'll die, right? Versus it used to be in the past, in their situation, it would have been your employer and HR went to what they call a TPA, or a third party administrator, and it was kind of more of a B2B conversation going on your behalf. Now you're having to broker for yourself. So we were brought in actually to help solve for how do you create empathy inside of an organization. And that was huge, right? Because that was like we were using NetBase and capturing all this data around consumer sentiment, right? So you understood what was happening. We shot some of the first narrative VR in hospitals, right? So really kind of, the backstory behind it is we built that business with the intent that we were solving really complex challenges in the digital ecosystem. What ended up happening to us was we were also serving as advisors to SOTA, which is the Society of Digital Agencies. So SOTA is a very exclusive organization backed by Adobe and Microsoft. And it's firms that are like, Spaceship and Barbarian and Domani, like all shops that have been acquired over time or done very, very well over time. Really unique companies. We built the study. One of the co-founders of the company with myself, he ran the study, which is the most comprehensive agency study out there on fees and structure and demand and what the market is doing. And it's a really fascinating study. And because of it, we started getting phone calls about, how do we transform our agency? So the next thing you know is we're actually meeting with agencies and working with them on their own transformation, because we didn't build anything. We only did strategy. So we would have to use those agencies to do implementation work for us. And we all of a sudden started getting more and more, I say all of a sudden, we started getting more and more requests. And then we ultimately ended up getting the request to do the acquisition on behalf of ICF International of Olsen Advertising. So it was us, PwC, Jeffries, Ad Media Partners. There were a number of companies that were all involved in that transaction. And we ended up leading that transaction, which was a $295 million acquisition of Olsen by ICF. And that was kind of my first real foray into doing, a big deal. And then 2 years later, they came to us and said, hey, we'd love to buy your firm and bring you guys inside of what was now called ICF, well, ultimately called ICF Next. Bring you inside of that firm because your consulting services would be, as a firm, would be really, really valuable. And they wanted our clients, of course, and our revenue. So that was where that's how that all kind of got started, was, heading down that path, if you will.
Right. And it's a cool niche, right? M&A in the agency space, but aren't agencies like one of the least scalable models out there? Like retaining clients and growing revenue seems to be incredibly hard, especially nowadays. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would tell you that high demand right now, very high demand right now for a few reasons, but high demand. They can be difficult to sell, right? It depends on the types of services and who the company is and kind of its structure. But I would tell you it's probably one of the more active categories, if you will, in part because we've merged all these pieces together, Charles, right? So we've merged like advertising with PR, with media, with big tech, right? With AI, with all of these different types of categories. And so there isn't really kind of a simple solution any longer, if that makes sense, right? When a company looks at it and goes, we want to, or even e-commerce, right? COVID changed a lot, right? So many companies had to make a massive pivot in a hurry, right? And as they made that massive pivot, it put them in a position where, they really required heavy lifting on the digital side. And digital typically interfaces with everything from, whether it is e-commerce and it's your PIM, which is, your product information management systems, to, your brand, to your narrative, to your app, to all various pieces. So the market's actually, you'd be surprised at how strong the market is right now. And then the other part, even like right now, if I said just today, what's driving a tremendous amount of it is, back in late December time period, when IPG and Omnicom, when that merger was announced, or acquisition was announced. So Omnicom acquiring IPG, creating what will now be the world's largest advertising holding company, taking over the spot that WPP has held forever. That really kind of put a big emphasis, if you will, for a lot of firms on, what do we do here? How do we grow? What services do we need? And so M&A has really kind of picked up around that space, if you will.
Right. So what criteria, how much time do you have, by the way? How much more time?
I'm good.
Okay, let's do 10 more because I want to dive a bit deeper as per the criterias. Not the criteria for you to acquire an agency because you do advising, but what do you look for into an agency that is actually acquirable, right? Like, because there's a bunch that aren't super stable. They don't have clear SOPs. They're not super scalable, in other words. So what criteria do you specifically look into an agency when it comes for them to be ready to be acquired?
Yeah. So again, man, you have great questions. So there's a number of things that are out there, right? I mean, so the first issue is that, what we talk about is in the agency space, there's especially when you're talking about like private equity or other strategics that are making acquisitions, you call it I call it the rule of 60, right? Which is 20 million in revenue, 20% EBITDA, and 20% growth. And the reality is that the 20 million in revenue, I think, has changed pretty dramatically, even recently. So you see a lot of smaller firms that are being acquired for a number of reasons. The key takeaway in all of it is, how much automation does the firm have? So, are they using AI? So are they doing like media mix modeling? Are they doing multi-touch attribution? What are they doing? But are they using AI? Are they using frameworks and data structures that make them really efficient? So one is how are they set up in terms of the automation? Two is, what's their contracting structure like? Are they retained? If they're long-term retained, then that's different than if you're just very project-oriented and project-based. And then you start to look at it and go, okay, well, how deep are they inside of their clients, right? Do they have multiple buying centers? Are they viewed as a strategic partner? And those things all really matter in the context of what's the lifetime value of the customer, right? So how long have they been in there, and what's the revenue stream look like? What's the breadth of the service offerings that you have? What's the contractual structure that you have? How profitable are you against that work? And then, what's the forward growth trajectory of the business look like? You're absolutely spot on. There's a ton of agencies that are just like, you know what? We love doing creative. We're really super creative. It's awesome. That's what we do. And you look at it and go, are you profitable? Not really, right? A lot of agencies are run by founders that look at their business as an annuity. So, they just take the cash out of the business, and if it's super profitable one year, they make a ton of money. If it doesn't make a whole lot of money another year, then they don't make a lot of money, right? That's not really an acquirable business, right? And so, what you really look for is the business growing every year, right? And is the business in a position where ultimately at the end of the day, it's, it has service offerings that are highly demanded versus are also kind of legacy types of services that are kind of waning, if you will.
And you mentioned automations. What have been the wildest use case of AI integrations you've seen in agencies? Are agencies ready nowadays to be run mostly on AI agents and few employees?
Yeah. So I think the challenge there is, I think there's two different views to how AI can benefit you as a company, right? There's the view that AI replaces many people, and therefore we just don't need nearly as much headcount and as many bodies, if you will. I think that lens, I think, is maybe the wrong lens to be really looking at a business through. The way that we look at it is, are the firms leveraging automation? Are they leveraging AI in a way that makes them incredibly efficient? So an example of that would be utilizing, AI-based media mix modeling. You can run hundreds of thousands of media plans and build hundreds of thousands of media plans off of, call it 2 years worth of data set, 3 years worth of data set off historical. You could have never built hundreds of thousands of scenarios and then clustered those and then have the AI give you best plans against targets. So I want to generate 2,360 net new customers this month. How do I do it? Well, the AI can do that for you, right? And it can even integrate directly into Trade Desk. It can integrate into Google, and you can basically have your buy. You can automate all of it. That used to take an enormous number of people, right? And it was a manual process fraught with lots of errors and lots of problems. When Facebook craps the bed at night, right, with its connectors and the data doesn't populate, you have a mess. Like, you can create real consistency and you can create real value out of AI. Here's the difference, though. If the goal is just to get the cost out and to run it way more efficiently, fine, you can be way more profitable and you don't need to have nearly as many people. The question is, why would you not take that efficiency and just scale the business? Why would you not now have 50 large media clients versus 5 that you were basically trying to maximize the profitability against? So our argument is this shouldn't be a cost out conversation. This should really be about, how does it create
enormous scalability for a business where it can now generate a tremendous amount more revenue and be much more highly profitable in that process. So I get a little testy sometimes when I hear people who are like, well, we're using AI and we think we're going to be able to get rid of all these people. And I'm like, why wouldn't you use AI to actually move the business from doing 20 million in revenue to 40 million in revenue?
Right. And identify mavericks that could work for you and superpower them sort of. Bob, where can people find out more about you?
Yeah, they can find me on LinkedIn, of course, although I have a very common name. But they can find me on LinkedIn. They can find me through bravery.group, which is our company site. And yeah, those are probably the two best ways to find me.